それでは引き続きましてディスカッションに移らせていただきます。西原議長、パネリストの皆様どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
4人の方の専門家のご意見を聞いた後で、これから30分間パネリストの間で議論をしたいと思っております。でその後皆様方からのご質問を受けて20分間受けるという形にしたいと思います。ちょっと予定より遅れておりますが、そうすることによって、16時50分ぐらいには議論を終えるようにしたいと思っております。時間の関係もありますので、各パネリストには、どの発言も3分以内でやってくださいという厳しい、お願いをいたしております。それでは最初にパネリストの間で何か議論を進めていきたいんですけれども、どなたからでもご発言の希望が終わりでした。それでたくさんいらっしゃると思いますから、テキパキとやっていろんな人が発言できるようにしていきたいというふうに思っております。じゃあ孫崎先生からどうぞ。
お願いします。黒西先生に、中国をどう見るかということは非常に重要なことになっております。今 ASEAN 諸国と中国との間で、行動についての検証があります。2002年ですけれども、ここでは航行の自由を保障する、それから、軍事力を使わない、それから、紛争に通ずるようなことはできるだけ避けると、こういうような、協定を ASEAN と中国は結んでます。このようなものが中国の行動を将来彼らがこのような考え方を中国の戦略の中で、あるいは行動の中でどのようにやっていくかとお考えになるか、そこのところちょっと見解をお伺いしたいと思います。
どうもありがとうございます。それでは最初に黒西先生から今の質問に対して簡単に答えていただけますか。
I wasn't expecting it to be a question, so I'm not sure I've understood it entirely. Let me explain very briefly the Chinese approach to the declaration of conduct of the parties, that is China and the 10 Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in dealing with rules of the road with respect to the South China Sea. China agreed to that in 2002, largely as a belated response to being heavily criticized for mischief reef and arguments that were militarized over the Spratly Islands in the mid-1990s. From 2002 until last year's ASEAN Regional Forum, chaired by the Indonesians, China did absolutely everything it could to stop any multilateral consensus. There were 17 different drafts, at least, by the ASEAN countries to try to get China to agree. It was, again, only in response to the criticism of China's heavy-handedness and assertiveness in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea that China took a diplomatic turn and agreed to the implementation guidelines of the Declaration of Conduct. The declaration was so watered down, that is, through these implementation guidelines, it was weaker than the 2002 statement. Okay, we actually took a step backwards, but we're pretending we went forward because everybody wanted to pretend we needed to have cooperation. We do need cooperation with China, and we do want China to be cooperative, but we're kidding ourselves, we're fooling ourselves if we think that they want to agree to a multilateral binding code of conduct. It is not going to happen anytime in the near term. And that's why military forces, that's why Morimoto Sensei's argument about the offshore balance of power is exactly the right strategic point. It's not because the military forces are going to come head-to-head in a fight. We hope that will never happen. But there is a balance of power game that is very important to the prosperity and peace of this region, and to Japan, and to the United States. And that's making sure that we shape a rising and increasingly assertive China, which has, as again Morimoto Sensei pointed out, China has legitimate reasons to be building up in the near seas, but they also have hegemonic purposes and interests. And the people in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and elsewhere in the government do not have Japan's best interests at heart or U.S. interests at heart. So we want to make sure that we combine in a tight alliance, looking ahead, to shape China step by step into a rules-based, open, inclusive system. We want to do it militarily. We want to do it in terms of trade. We want to do it in terms of energy security, helping China find their own secure energy in the future. But if you don't have a backbone of a military cooperation, then you're negotiating from weakness. We need to cooperate from strength.
どうもありがとうございました。それではグレッグソンさんお願いします。
And I won't take all 3 minutes, but I'd like to respond to Morimoto Sensei's question at the end of the previous session about why the United States took all the money out for Guam and what the logic was behind it. There was no logic behind it. Probably our most distinguished Japanese American, Senator Daniel Inouye, about 3 years ago visited Washington. He talked to the U.S. administration in Washington, and then he came to Japan and talked to the Japanese administration in Tokyo, and went to Naha and talked to the Okinawa prefectural government. And his warning was, do not let this become an issue that is captured by the legislature, because the legislature makes very clumsy decisions. And that's what happened with the loss of money for Guam. The United States Senate was convinced that the agreement that called for the movement of Futenma linked to the movement of Marines to Guam was never going to happen, so that's why they put a hold not only on appropriating U.S. funds, but would not allow the administration to spend the Japanese funds that have been appropriated and transferred to the U.S. for Guam, the so-called Mamizu funding. So that's the whole reason behind it. There was no grand design on it. It was strictly a matter of the legislature in the United States being unhappy with the administration in the United States because the plan that we told them that was going to happen in Japan had not worked.
村田先生どうも。
それだと私にもう一つ疑問が出るんですが、切り離しの決断をして米軍の新たな再編計画を示したことによって現在日米間で再編協議を行っている、ご存知の通りです。でも真水について、アメリカが要求していることに日本政府が応じることができずに真水の負担を増やすことができなければ、アメリカの議会は2014年以降のガムの建設経費をまたゼロ査定にする、つまり認めないということになる可能性があるんですか。もしそうだとすれば、再編計画によって8000人を海兵隊の8000人を沖縄から動かすというアメリカの提案は全く実現できなくなる、そういうことになるんでしょうか。
I would never try to predict what the U.S. Congress would do. We used to smile behind our hand at the Japanese twisted diet until we got a twisted legislature. So it's impossible to predict it. But I would point out that one of the things that we're missing here is something I tried to go to in my remarks. All of the conversation that's gone back and forth on this has been about small issue politics, and we're missing the strategic and the political rationale behind the alliance transformation and realignment. This is not moving Marines away from Okinawa because we don't get along with the governor. I used to live in Okinawa. We get along with the governor. It is an expansion of the U.S.-Japan alliance together to the Mid-Pacific with the great potential that with the continuous presence of Japanese air, ground, and sea forces in Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and other places in the Mid-Pacific, we can do robust, high-end, advanced bilateral training, U.S. and Japanese forces together, and together we can be much better in the future and much more effective when we're operating together than we are now. And given the growing tensions in the region and the potential threats in the region, I submit this is a strategic necessity for the alliance to do this.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。真崎先生、
はい、
別の点ですか、今の点ですか。
アライアンスグレグさん
はい、
おったことと、
はい、じゃあどうぞ。
基本的に日米がどういう戦略を持つか、戦略情勢をよく理解するかということは非常に重要なことですね。それに関係して聞きます。先ほど私が申したことなんですけれども、お願いします。出てますか。はい。中国をどう見るかっていうのは非常に重要ですよね。それで2009年の中国の軍事力について国防省報告というのがありました。でその中でさっき申し上げましたように、中国の共産党の生き残りのためには経済を発展させなければいけない。そのためには市場の確保がいり、資源のアクセスが必要である。だから無駄な緊張をするということはしないということが国防省報告の2009年です。それから2011年版には、近い将来米国及び隣国との安定的関係を持つことが中国の国家のために、安定のために不可欠だということを言っている。この点についてお二人のどちらからコメントをいただきたいと思います。
じゃあクロンニーさんいかがですか。中国をどう見るかという点ですね。
China's complex. I can't give you one answer. The reality is we have to live with a duality when we look at China. We can't look at just the nice China, and we can't look at just the big rising bad China. They both are going to coexist because we both want better relations and more trade with China. I think the professor's right. We do need to help China have guaranteed access to energy resources. And I call for this in a report that we'll be issuing in May during the Golden Week Summit, I hope, with Prime Minister Noda in Washington. But we also have to recognize that with hedging against a rising China, when China looks at resources, it says that essentially we always get more than 50%. I mean, that's how they've defined, using historical, not legal terms, their claims in the South China Sea. And if we're going to put pressure on China, the best way to put pressure on China is that balance of power, so that we can essentially impose what is called the Malacca dilemma. If you can threaten to close down the Malacca Straits and the associated straits upon which the sea lines of communication are critical for China, you don't actually do it. You keep them open. That's what we're all about, keeping these open for open access for all. That's exactly what's allowed China to rise. We intend to work with Japan to keep that open. But by having a preponderance of military power, they know that we could theoretically close it despite their anti-access capabilities, and that will make them better behaved. That's my argument. I believe that. That's part of a strategy that I think is shared in military circles in US and Japan, and that's the hard edge of this otherwise cooperative relationship with China. And China has a very hard edge to their strategies. Don't be fooled. Think about the cyber attacks on Japan. They're growing. Think about the cyber espionage. China has gotten into the most sensitive secrets. Okay? That's just one issue that you don't see. And there are many others.
じゃあグレッグさん、先にちょっとグレッグさんって挙げられましたか。
Let me endorse completely what Dr. Cronin just said and come at it from a different direction. The ambassador asked what kind of strategy we have. The United States, and I would submit Japan, although I can't speak for Japan, need China to be successful, prosperous, and happy. We all have a vital economic relationship with China. We need that to continue, and we need that to grow. At the same time, conflicts do not start because of logical reasons. In 1913, the world agreed that World War I was impossible because it was not logical. It happened anyway, and we killed most of the population, or a good portion of the population of Europe before it was over. What we need to have deterrence through strength, as Dr. Cronin mentions, but it needs to be done in a manner that's not provocative, not picking a fight. The South and East China Seas, as I mentioned, are a hub of commerce. If there's a commercial center to the world, that is it. China's industrial epicenter, their economic epicenter, exist along the coast of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. their GDP per capita along the coast is much, much higher than it is anywhere else in the country. They feel vulnerable because of that. So there are the critical interests of both China and the United States and Japan intersecting in the East and the South China Seas. This has to be managed very carefully, and it has to be managed through strength that is there but not provocative. In the survival of the Communist Party, yes, how China is governed depends on economic growth. How that works out is completely up to China, but we need to be able to make sure we maintain and protect our own interest in the meantime.
どうぞ。
はい今の話と少し関連するんですけれども、ザカリアさんがこういうことを言ったんですよね。核兵器の時代、もう米中っていうのはファイナンシャルも含めて手を握るよりしょうがない、ね、基本的には米中は事実的に戦略的に手を結ぶ方向に動いてますと、これはもう不可避であると。しかしながらいろんなことがあるから、ヘッジとしてインドと日本、こういうような国を中国に対抗するように流れを作っていかなきゃいけない、これはヘッジだと、こういうような関係をザカリアさんが言ったんですけれども、この考え方はどこがおかしいでしょうか。ちょっと説明してください。
黒人さんいかがありますか？
Am I supposed to argue with myself? Is there anything wrong with this position? I don't understand about hedging, about the need to hedge. Yes, there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with China's behavior, that they don't have enough transparency or accountability in their political system, that we have to worry so much about a rising China. Double-digit increases in military spending year after year, much of it hidden actually from the budget, with a group of people who are not necessarily accountable to the political leaders as they go through political shift. That's what's the matter with this.
多分質問が伝わってないと思うんです。もう一回質問します。今の多分私の質問。
だから中国以外の問題にも移りたいんですけど、30分間ありませんからね。よろしかったらどうぞ。はい。
ちょっと非常にプロフェッショナルな質問をグレグソン中将にお聞きしたいんですが、今日米でやってる再編協議の結果、沖縄から海兵隊の部隊が例えばですね、4700人、その中に海兵隊の連隊が2つ、もちろんそれに司令部、後方部隊、ヘリの部隊が沖縄からガムに移るということを想定した場合、南西方面におけるアメリカの海兵隊による抑止の力は今よりも下がると思われますか。でこれはどういうふうに対応するかは日本が考えるべきことなので、どういうふうにアメリカに何をしてくれと言うべき問題ではなく、日本が自ら考えるべきであることは分かるんですが、プロフェッショナルな軍人だったしかも沖縄におられた指揮官として、一体その戦闘部隊が主としてガムに移った場合の抑止力を全体としてどういうふうに評価できるかっていうことについて、率直にお伺いしてみたいわけです。
グレッグさん、どうぞ。
Prior to answering that, let me state that that who and what will move to Guam has gotten tremendously confused ever since 2006. Nagashima-san mentioned that the Marine Corps fights as an organized Marine Air Ground Task Force. It's called. This is a balanced force, and that's what we will move to Guam, and that's what will remain in Japan, and that's what will remain in Hawaii, much as it does now. So you will end up with what is called the Marine Expeditionary Brigade in each of the three places. Now, to the more important question about moving 8,000 or 4,700, whatever the number turns out to be, Marines from Okinawa to Guam, does that increase or decrease deterrence in the Nansei-Shoto? It will decrease deterrence in the Nansei-Shoto unless we take advantage of one of the major strategic reasons for building up the base in Guam, and that is to be able to conduct robust, continuous, high-end bilateral training, U.S. and Japanese forces together, to improve our ability to operate together. One of the unsung success stories of the Alliance Transformation and Realignment Program was the co-location of Japanese and American air and missile defense command and control at Yokota Air Force Base. When the flight time of weapons is measured in minutes, somewhere below 5 minutes, of weapons that could visit great destruction on Japan, then it's very important that we'll be able to coordinate the defenses in real time. The same thing occurs with being able to operate Japanese air, ground, and maritime self-defense forces together, and especially putting the American forces in there. We need to continually practice and improve our capabilities to operate together, and without being able to take advantage of the training areas available in Guam and the training environment that can be created there, we won't be able to do that. Japan is a tremendously developed nation. There's not a lot of room left because of the urbanization of Japan. The easiest way to create this training capability is down there in Guam and in the surrounding islands. And through that, the proficiency of our forces operating together will increase, which will increase our deterrence capability.
Thank you. Thank you.
はい。他にいかがですか。なければ私の方から一つ質問したいです。確かグレッグソンさんがおっしゃったのには、沖縄から基地を県外あるいは国外に移すと空白ができると、バキュームができると、これは南西地域の安全保障にとってマイナスであるというご指摘がある。ところが、山崎先生は、海兵隊の基地は沖縄から外へ出ていくのがいいんだというご議論でしたけれども、この点は空白という点につきましては山崎先生はどういうふうに答えられるんですか。
私は自衛隊で完全に埋められると思っています。
はい、それは森本先生あるいはクロニンさん、グレッグソンさん、何かご意見があったらおっしゃってください。
いや日本の自衛隊が米軍が行っていると同等の軍事的役割を果たすには政治的困難を、克服しないといけない。そこに非常に大きなバリアがあると考えて私はいます。
はい。あと5分ぐらいあります。
ちょっと一つだけ、非常に広い質問をちょっとクロリンさんにお話ししたいんでちょっと聞いてください。私は間違ってるかもしれないけど TPP っていう問題はそもそもアメリカが FTA を始めて、4カ国で、TPP を始めたのに2008年アメリカがこれに参入することによって TPP がディファレントクリエイチャーに別の生き物になってきてアジア太平洋の大きな経済の自由化をプロモートする枠組みに発展しつつあるが中国が入れないということを知っていて、その今参加しようとしている国によって新しい制度設計を行いその制度設計を間接的に中国にエンカレッジし中国がこれを受け入れることによって将来中国が入れるという役割を果たしている。裏返してこの問題を議論するとつまり TPP というのは中国が入れない状態で制度設計をし中国をゆっくりアジア太平洋の国で包囲をしながら中国の中を変えていこうとする非常に意欲的な枠組みであるともし考えればです。その考え間違ってるかもしれないけども考えればですねこれを安全保障の面に当てはめて考える と日本とアメリカが中心になって、少なくとも TPP のようなアジア太平洋の安全保障秩序を作り、初めは中国が入れないがやがて入るような枠組みを作っていくことがアジア太平洋の安定のために役立つのではないかというふうに私は考えているんです。一体そういうことができるのか。いや、できるとすればアメリカがどうこれに対応するかということが鍵になるんです。つまり、2006年に作った最初の TPP にはアメリカは全く関心を示さずに、2008年アメリカが TPP に入るといった途端 TPP が全く世界的に注目されるようになったぐらいアメリカにとって重要な役割を持ってたわけですよね。安全保障についてアメリカはアジア太平洋の新しい安全保障秩序の枠組みを作ることにどれだけ国家の意図あるいは国家の目的があるかということについて率直にご意見を伺いたいと。
それではクローニン先生かグレッグソン先生、ごく簡単に、あともうあまり時間がありませんが 1,2 分で、答えていただけますでしょうか。大変大きな問題ですけれども。
Trans-Pacific Partnership in 1 minute. The United States and Japan need a strong economic and trade foundation for their future security. We have a chance in Trans-Pacific Partnership to create the kind of open, inclusive, rules-based trading system in the decades ahead that would serve our interests by guaranteeing things like our intellectual property rights, going beyond the kind of at-border tariffs that simple free trade agreements deal with, and leveling the playing field against things like state-owned enterprises so that private sector growth can occur. This is vital for U.S. and Japan. We not only have to get our own economic houses in order, like our debt and our entitlement programs, but we also have to figure out a successful trading program. And TPP at least offers that vision, but we have a long, long way to go.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。大体30分経ちました。まだたくさん問題があると思いますけれども、会場の皆さん方からのご質問にも少しは答えられるようにしたいと思いますので、そちらに移りたいと思います。